and you're listening to General Intellect Unit. This week we're back with part 2 of our discussion of xenofeminism. So if you haven't caught the first episode, I'd recommend you pause this one, go back one episode, and start from there. As always, thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoy the show. So this next section, this one slid off my brain. I just couldn't get a grip on it at all. The 0x, 0D. What's this one about?
Yeah, this feels like in a section that is full of these absolutely piercing takes. This is very kind of amorphous.
It's a vestigial tale or something.
Yeah. So what essentially what the section is talking about is how we need to be conscious of the memes and language that are used online, and how memes like anonymity, ethics, social justice, and privilege checking host social dynamisms at odds with the often commendable intentions with which they're taken up. Which is just to say that this is kind of about polysemy and the way in which the meanings of things can shift in online discourse, right? And how we need to be conscious in our interactions with language, and be instrumental in our interactions with language online. And I think that's something that people are very conscious of, coming out of the linguistic turn and all of the social theory that came out of that, influencing the sort of upbringing of the Tumblr generation. I think people are very conscious of these things, but at the same time, they are very difficult to struggle with, and they're sometimes out of our control. There's something we need to pay attention to. But again, this is not a very clear paragraph, no. I think.
Along those lines, it's kind of like saying these things are not what they seem. Anonymity, ethics, social justice, and privilege checking are not what they seem online. You'd think they'd be good, but they're not.
Yeah. Watch out. Yeah.
Yeah, because they're structured to not do what they say they're going to do. And so it seems like the structure is the manipulation of desires, puppet strings. I don't know, all the stuff it says later on. It is a little ambiguous in what it's saying, because I think it wants to be positive.
Yeah.
I got tripped up on this one pretty badly. Oh boy. Just need to get better at reading. But anyway, coming on to the next one, get into the parity section, and we get into one of the sort of major locuses that these people are focused on, gender abolitionism. Yeah, this is an interesting paragraph, and that it's sort of all about when we say gender abolitionist, it's not kind of eradicating. It's not necessarily eradicating the existence of gender, but sort of proliferating gender to such an extent that it becomes invalid as a basis for power or through difference. It's so much difference that you can't be used as a sorting function to differentiate anything anymore, which is a good take. It's a really interesting take.
Yeah, it says gender abolitionism is shorthand for the ambition to construct a society where traits currently assembled under the rubric of gender no longer furnish a grid for the asymmetric operation of power. And I think that is important because it gets at the dimension of oppression that is connected to identity, and that's where we need to be focusing.
Yeah. This paragraph was awesome for me.
Woo.
Yeah. This actually enlightened me of a few things that I struggle with gender in myself sometimes. Being a non-binary person, my gender fluctuates. I'm gender queer. I'm not in the middle of man and woman. I'm just I don't agree with those definitions. And I don't fit into any kind of line in between those two things. And I love the idea of gender abolitionism, in the sense that we get rid of that concept. It says, let 100 sexes bloom, which I don't know why they said sexes, but that's fine.
Right.
But, I think that the concept is a very non-binary concept. And it's interesting because another YouTuber I watched, ContraPoints, who is a recently out trans woman, she's coming out on YouTube, which is bananas, like going through her transition publicly, right? And she had recently talked about how she thinks that non-binary people are fighting for something harder than binary trans people are, something weirder and more radical about gender. And it is kind of similar to this concept of gender abolitionism.
Right.
No, I was going to say that I feel like it's also really important that this is stated in terms of multiplicity and proliferation of genders, because when the term gender abolition comes up, a lot of normies sort of react as like it's like a sort of like a Stalinist imposition that we're going to erase gender by making everyone dress in grey uniforms and shaving everyone's heads or something, which would be the sort of like collapsing to one gender essentially. But this is like talking about proliferating so many genders that it's there's no point keeping track of them anymore. It's just like there's just so much that it's like the way sand behaves as a fluid, right? Like that there are so many particles, so many individual things that you zoom out and it just feels like a swirling kind of fluid mass. And it's really interesting that it's counterposed against like the sort of the opposite, which would be like collapsing and forcing everyone into one identity or whatever. This is now you can have as many identities as you want. You can take them, like grab a bucket. There's plenty to go around,
Absolutely, and I think that is where we are headed. We have always been there for sure. Like in our past, we have accepted more than two genders, but even more than three, right? And it's a very sci-fi concept. Like getting back to the Xenofeminism, like this idea of like hundreds of gender opportunities, and everyone can see them.
Yes.
Not just the queer folks. And that gets rid of that power dynamic of the patriarchal power dynamic, which this is such a cool description. No longer furnish a grid for the asymmetric operation of power.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
It's just so good because it doesn't once say men.
Yeah.
It just talks about the power dynamics inherent in gender, and because there's power dynamics inherent in other genders too. It's talked about a lot recently, the power dynamics between binary trans people and non-binary trans people, for example. And so that was just so cool. I thought it was such a great way of putting it. It's not necessarily masculine or men or the patriarchy, just like we need to be aware of what that power dynamic looks like.
Yeah, and I really like the way that they connect this like intersectionally. So when they talk about race of abolitionism, it's like, well, yeah, like, these sort of physical markers or physical characteristics will no longer be categorized into races, right? Like those arbitrary distinctions will not be policed. And then they talk about class abolitionism, right? And I really like this line at the end here. You're not exploited or oppressed because you are a wage laborer or poor. You are a laborer or poor because you are exploited, right? And this is getting to the relational nature of these things, right? And I think that's very, very important. It's very important to understand that, yeah, like getting away from your exploitation as an identity and focusing on the exploitation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the next paragraph then sort of continues. It sort of builds on that thought a little bit with the understanding that these abolitions hinge on a sort of reworking of the universal. And the sort of gist here is that it's a sort of rejecting the kind of false universals of, taking a particular trait such as whiteness or maleness and turning that particular into a universal, and instead digging down under all of the particulars to find the sort of real universal substrate of humanity, and sort of hinging on that as your concept of a universal. So it is a sort of it's in one way it's telling us to try and reclaim a notion of a universal which has been sort of lost recently, I think. Or in more recent times, in that, like, because we're rejecting, whiteness as a universal, maleness as a universal, and so on, there's a danger of ending up in a place where there are no universals, which leaves you with no ground to stand on for these abolitionist sort of projects.
Absent such a universal, the abolition of class will remain a bourgeois fantasy. The abolition of race will remain a tacit white supremacism, and the abolition of gender will remain a thinly veiled misogyny, especially when prosecuted by avowed feminists themselves. So it's a very, very strong statement here. Reacting to Eurocentrism, reacting to just like the patriarchy, to white supremacy, and towards the cisgendered norms of our society, right? But like saying those things do not negate the validity of the universal as a liberatory principle. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. It's like a subversion of status quo. It's like what this is kind of talking about. It's very feminism, intersectional feminism 101 in a lot of ways. Actually, it's just talking. I guess it goes a step further than intersectional feminism, which usually says we need to deconstruct, these, and it says actually we need to rebuild a universal, right? It's not good enough to just deconstruct it. We need to rebuild it.
Yes.
I think that's kind of cool because xenofeminism seems to be a lot about building things.
Yeah.
It's like
positive orientation. Yeah.
Yeah. So, taking the offensive, not just deconstructing it and making something new. So that's super cool. Like you can't just get rid of gender. You have to build new status quos for gender and build new genders,
Yes.
Yeah, and speaking of building, then that brings us on to the next paragraph, where we're talking about like building a sort of mutable architecture that, like open source software, remains available for perpetual modification and enhancement following the navigational impulse of militant ethical reasoning. So this is continuing that theme of being positive and building things up, but also sort of wanting to have it be a flexible sort of mutant architecture that can kind of serve as a platform for all these things developing going forwards.
Yeah, I loved this idea. This tied back to staying with the trouble a lot too. Where Donna Haraway is, she kind of talks about all these different feminist ecological art projects that are the easiest one to talk about is how a lot of feminists decided to collectively all over the world make art installations that looked like coral reefs. So they were like and they were often like knitted or crocheted with like it's like a women's art type of thing. And it was basically a big project that anyone could do to raise awareness about the dying coral reef. This reminds me a lot of that. It's kind of like a collaborative, ever-changing art project. Like that's what gender should be.
Right.
Yeah, and that's so cool. As an artist, like I'm totally on board with that. It's really, and it's about building that together. It's about working.
Yeah, I think this line here, open, however, does not mean undirected. The most durable systems in the world owe their stability to the way they train order to emerge as an invisible hand from apparent spontaneity, or exploit the inertia of investment and sedimentation. I especially just think that this kind of ties into the kind of autopoiesis stuff that we saw with cybernetics, right? That there is a cybernetic angle to be talked about here in terms of building these things as a universal in process, building these things as a work of art or a series of works of art or an assembly of works of art, but also creating systems that are autopoietic and produce sort of auto-generating effects in a positive direction.
Yeah, which is similar to it's the sort of this same thematic notion of like a virality, that it's a new sort of thing that's going to spread itself. And for the listeners who aren't familiar, autopoiesis is this characteristic of a system that produces more of itself as it grows. Again, this viral notion, right? Like we're building this open mutant sort of platform that will spread of its own accord and have the way they put it with this like invisible hand, right? Like it sort of reminds me of a claim. I think it's sort of adjacent to the whole accelerationist thing of like, well, that capitalism is this rhizomatic sort of auto-generating kind of thing, and that the thing that overtakes it needs to outperform it at that game, right? Like to be even more rhizomatic and even more auto-generating.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Also, it kind of not destabilizes is not the right word, but it basically gets rid of the person in charge. Like there's not one person in charge. Mm-hmm. Like there's a system in charge. And so that like changes the power structure of how the thing is run, right? Like it's not like a white woman in charge, for example. Yes. It's a collective.
Yes.
And it's a system and a group, and this kind of also seems like a criticism a little bit of those communities again. like we can build a community that is a system that is auto running, and if we build it right, like a computer system, like we should look at those, like look at open source software as inspiration.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So moving on to the adjust section, we get There's only 2 paragraphs in the section, but the first one begins with, our lot is cast with technoscience, where nothing is so sacred that it cannot be re-engineered and transformed so as to widen our aperture of freedom, extending to gender and to the human. Like nothing is supernatural. Everything is bounded inside the sphere of nature, and nature is fully mutable. Like, it's the same cybernetic monism that keeps coming up, right? Like, the whole sort of the whole thing is one system, and it's available for engineering.
Yeah, and it's the response to the earlier criticisms, right? In tearing down melancholy and illusion, the unambitious and the non-scalable, the libidinized puritanism of certain online cultures, and nature as an unremakable given, we find that our normative anti-naturalism has pushed us towards an unflinching ontological naturalism. There is nothing we claim that cannot be studied scientifically and manipulated technologically. It's very much... I think this may be an interesting point to talk about alienation here, right? Which is, I think when we criticize alienation on this show, we are often talking about the ways in which we are not able to experience the the ontological variety and richness of reality. Because of the circumstances that we find ourselves in, and that is often related to the labor process, right? That we are cordoned off into productive boxes that deeply restrict the variety of our experience in a very harmful way, very painful way. And when they're talking about alienation here, it seems to be coming from a place of recognizing that nature or claims about what is given and natural are similarly restrictive. And in that sense, I think that they are very much working towards the same end of developing this kind of experiential plurality, diversity, and freedom. And that is the end to which they are advocating alienation and this kind of anti-naturalism, right? This normative anti-naturalism as opposed to their ontological naturalism. So I think there is actually a great deal of overlap with what we've been saying so far in the show and what is being advocated in this manifesto. It's just that we've approached it from this kind of like philosophical background of humanism, whereas they're approaching it from this anti-humanism, and in fact, there's all these interesting overlaps.
Yeah, it's fantastic. We'll probably get a lot more into that when we get into the critical post-humanism bit in a couple of episodes.
Oh, yeah.
Cool.
Yep.
Anyone want to take the next one?
To be honest, I didn't understand this part too much. So
is this another vestigial tale, like at the end of a section?
Yeah. Okay. I'll have a shot at this. It says. Okay, so it says here, this does not mean that the distinction between the ontological and the normative, between fact and value, is simply cut and dried. The vectors of normative anti-naturalism and ontological naturalism span many ambivalent battlefields. The project of untangling what ought to be from what is, of dissociating freedom from fact, will from knowledge, is indeed an infinite task. There are many lacunae where desire confronts us with the brutality of fact, and where beauty is indissociable from truth. Poetry, sex, technology, and pain are incandescent with this tension we have traced. But give up on the task of revision, release the reins, and slacken that tension, and these filaments instantly dim. So they're getting to this point that they're saying is like, we are normatively anti-naturalist, but ontologically naturalist, which is to say, we're normatively against the given as a restriction on our freedom, but we are also scientists, right? We also believe in the natural world, in science, in understanding nature, and that this introduces a real tension in our experience of the world, right? That you know, we are very much oriented to what the world that ought to be and is not, but we are also very much oriented towards the world that is, right, in the sense that we are scientists. And so we got to deal with that, right? It's kind of what I'm saying, like, yeah, this is a tension. This is a real tension. But you give up on that tension, right? You take one path or the other, and the filaments dim, right? The light goes out. That productive tension, that dialectical tension, is removed, and so yeah, that's kind of the point of what they're saying here, I think.
I like that. That's cool. So I mean that we're skeptical about claims about reality, but there is in fact a real, like, and you're held in tension between those two positions.
Yeah. It does seem like another non-binary argument in this manifesto, to be honest. It's like, stop looking at these extremes. Like, don't do one or the other, or live within the tension between them, right?
Yeah.
Understand that there is not just the two, but both of them, or understand both those perspectives and look beyond that.
Yeah, it's very much sort of echoing Hegel here. Is my view. Yeah.
Cool. So coming on to the carry section, we're on to 0x13. Yeah, Kira, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Let's see. Oh, we're talking about the potential of early text-based internet culture again. Yeah. How let's see. Countering the potential for text-based internet culture for countering repressive gender regimes, generating solidarity among marginalized groups, and creating new spaces for experimentation that ignited cyberfeminism in the 90s has clearly waned in the 21st century. It's so true. I feel this one so much as a child who was on the internet in the 90s. The dominance of the visual in today's online interfaces has reinstated familiar modes of identity policing, power relations, and gender norms and self-representation. But this does not mean that the cyber-feminist sensibilities belong to the past. Yay, something good. Sorting the subversive possibilities from the oppressive ones latent in today's web requires a feminism sensitive to the insidious return of old power structures, yet savvy enough to know how to exploit the potential. So, and then it goes on to say, digital technology not separable from the material realities that underwrite them. So, the internet is the real world. A lot of people, rely on the alibi and the anonymity that the internet gives you, but really the structures are just replicated. The structures of the real world are just replicated online because it is the real world where it's just in a different space. So that seems to be the main argument of this, just to realize that and realize that, what does it say about xenofeminism here? Wait. Rather than arguing for the primacy of the virtual over the material or the material over the virtual, xenofeminism grasps points of power and powerlessness in both to unfold this knowledge as effective interventions in our jointly composed reality. So I guess it's just telling you to look at those strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, and I kind of read it as well as being kind of a follow-on from the previous bit, this kind of because they're building up this picture of that kind of cybernetic monism, and that the material and the virtual are they're both real, right? Like and they're both entangled kind of phenomena, and that they feed on each other in this reciprocal kind of way. And as you were saying, it's not enough to just dismiss, the online stuff that's not real life. That's because it is immaterial, but it is real in the way that virtual things are.
Yeah, and as somebody who was trained in the field of communication, where the concept of immaterial labor has a lot of cachet and currency, this is speaking to my soul. This is let's think about the material, because there's a lot of sort of idealist bullshit that has crept into discourse about information technologies, and it is not to, it's exactly as they say, let's not discount either. The virtual is effective. The material is effective. These can be conceptually separated, but they're deeply intertwined. It's good stuff.
Your comment about labor, immaterial labor, reminded me of emotional labor, like the invisibility of emotional labor, and how that was, first talked about through ladies service workers and sometimes tech workers, the type of work that they had to do. That's really interesting to think about from an emotional labor standpoint.
I completely agree, and I agree so much with that, and it's very important to equally think about emotional labor in a material sense, right? Think about the physicality of emotional labor, right? That is just as important about thinking about so-called immaterial labor in light of the material. These things need to be related to each other, and they're all super important.
I think it's very interesting that we have this kind of recurring theme of rejecting these kind of crass binaries by insisting that actually they're entangled phenomena, right? Because you get that very crude sort of materialism that would say that emotional labor is bullshit, virtual stuff is bullshit. There's only real, just concrete materialism. And we say no, these are both real, but in different ways, and there's an entangled sort of mutually constitutive pair of phenomena going on there. Which is, it's sliding from a binary sort of thing to something much more fluid, and where you can view the object from many different angles. But also it doesn't just drift off into complete constructivism either, right? Where it's just completely unmoored from reality. This is still very concerned with realness and actuality.
This dualism stuff reminds me Donna Haraway's critique of dualisms in the Cyborg Manifesto. I actually just brought it up to say this one sentence. She goes through a list of dualisms. To recapitulate, certain dualisms have been persistent in Western traditions. They have all been systemic to the logics and practices of domination of women, people of color, nature, workers, animals. In short, domination of all constituted as others whose task is to mirror the self. Chief among these troubling dualisms are self, other, mind, body, culture, nature, male, female, civilized, primitive, reality, appearance, whole, part, agent, resource, maker, made, active, passive, right, wrong, truth, illusion. That's a big one in the Xenofeminism, and total, partial, God, man. So she kind of like makes a list of all those dualisms, and this is like an extension of that, where it's like breaking down those dualisms.
Absolutely, and we've seen, in sort of countless episodes at this point, how many of those dualisms have been active in framing discourse around IT, around tech, around online. The God, man, right? Man, woman, mental and physical, like all of these things are like super involved in this, and to recognize that these are intertwined phenomena. Virtual material could be added to that, right? It's very important. And I would just say, just want to give shout outs to Fraser Simons, our once and future guest, that if playing his game The Veil, which is to a large extent about this conflation of virtual material, was a really nice way to be able to think about this. So
Right.
Yeah.
So in summary, fuck dualism. I'm going all in on Spinoza.
The Wachowskis would agree.
But yeah, I mean, the next section, the next paragraph is a pretty short one, but it sort of transitions from that from the virtual to the crudely physical. In there, talking about the built environment and how we sort of need to keep this in mind as a point of leverage for change, right? That like built environment, public spaces, living space, and social life are all sort of tied up in each other, and they trail off with the potential to foreclose, restrict, or open up future social conditions. Xenofeminists must become attuned to the language of architecture as a vocabulary for collective choreography, the coordinated writing of space. Yeah, nice. And then the next bit kind of finishes off that thought by bringing it into the domestic sphere, and calls for kind of a reimagining of the home, right? And kind of, why take the sort of Oedipal domestic sphere that we know as a given, right? Like, why not build communal workshops and sort of laboratories and these sorts of futuristic living spaces,
I love this paragraph.
Yeah.
It's so good. We see too well that reinvention of family structure and domestic life are currently only possible at the cost of either withdrawing from the economic sphere, the way of the commune, or bearing its burdens manyfold, the way of the single parent. If we want to break that inertia of the nuclear family unit, then we have to overhaul the material infrastructure and break the economic cycles that lock it in place. Yes, it is capitalism that traps us in, the two family, 2.5 kid home in America. It's very isolationist. It's a very individualist, like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, every person for themselves. And I think that this is a great critique of that, and like breaking down the idea of the family or of the home, and that a lot of, I think, polyamorous queer activists are working on doing now.
Yeah, boy, this definitely speaks to me a lot. I just add that what I've seen in my time in Japan is that the capitalism can absolutely reinforce the nuclear family in America, in very destructive ways. But in the case of a country like Japan, it can reinforce the structures of a multi-generational family in incredibly destructive and toxic ways. It's not necessarily the fact that it's not like, oh, should we choose this structure of relation or this structure of relation? It's the fact that capitalism tends to prescribe a model and you stick to that model, right? And that is like absolutely harmful to many, many people. It certainly has been something I've struggled with very, very deeply in my life, and I absolutely feel the economic burden of, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, it's also, I mean, live that way too. You know, have to share homes with multi-generational and multiple parents, you know, friend parenting. If you can't afford, or, you know, the millennial curse or whatever, like moving back in with your parents, like if you can't afford to have your own family anymore, like if you can't afford the capitalist ideal anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you get, you know, look at like Ocasio-Cortez, like getting attacked for not being able to afford to move to DC and like her place of work, right? Like, you know, it's that capitalist ideal is being policed right there.
And so the section closes out with the call to overhaul the material infrastructure and break these kind of economic cycles to keep this stuff going, because these are, again, entangled phenomena, right? Like, but the next section then takes us on to biohacking and
Yes,
Kira, this is your field of expertise, I believe.
I'm not super expertisey, but I am very interested in it. So I love how this paragraph is talking about the DIY HRT that a lot of trans folks use. They first got their hormones, you know, online illegally because doctors wouldn't give it to them. And so it talks about the idea of bodily autonomy, like gaining autonomy over our bodies through gaining understanding and use of medical tools. And this is so cool. You know, the rise of the internet and the hydra of black market pharmacies, it let loose, together with a publicly accessible archive of endocrinological know-how, was instrumental in wresting control of the hormonal economy away from gatekeeping institutions seeking to mitigate threats to established distributions of the sexual. This is like such a lady issue. I mean, like, I'm just like freaking out right now about like the possible overturnment of Roe versus Wade. Like, what, in America? Like, abortions that are hard enough to get already, by the way, would then be illegal again. And like, you know, how a lot of biohacking movements are about this. They're about the politics of the body and giving access to marginalized people things that they don't have through the system.
Yeah, absolutely.
Real good.
Yeah, it's real good. That's something I care about. You know, and I know a lot of people with depression. My partner has type 1 diabetes, and just like what the health industry does to us is horrific. And if we had access to biohacking, that wouldn't even be a problem anymore.
And one thing that sort of occurred to me is that this throws into kind of stark relief just how much all this sort of stuff is conditioned by the social, in that, like, if you this stuff would like seem to be less of an issue for you know, somebody who maybe lives in a country with a national health service where they can just go to a doctor and get the hormones, you know, like, or where it's easier. Like, and the gatekeeping is so much more obvious when you're able to contrast. You know, that these people over here have easy access, these people over here don't, and need to rely on the black market stuff.
I mean, it's I guess it's a matter of degree, right? Like, having the public provision of medical goods is absolutely a way to open things up. Of course, we need to be conscious of the ways in which public health services are also conditioned by, you know, heteronormative patriarchy. Yeah, right.
Because it's still within that sort of realm of deciding what's inside the fence and what's out. Right.
Oh, absolutely.
Even in there are things that, you know, today are considered outside of the realm of the NHS, which really should be inside of its realm, and so on. So but what I mean is that it highlights precisely that there is this fence, that a thing is placed either on the inside of or on the outside of, and that is subject to social control, right?
Yeah, and I love how this posits that we need to make that ourselves. Like, we need to take that from them.
We need to take control of the fence.
Yeah,
or knock down the fence.
Yeah. Which is powerful for a manifesto, but again goes back to the not super realistic. We can't all become doctors and then do the studies needed to advance women's medicine so that we understand what birth control actually does.
And that's why we need a collective project, right?
Right.
I mean, this is about seizing the means of self-production and self-modification, and that can be a collective process.
Yeah, and they make reference to the open source sort of stuff again here, like in by comparison. So like, and is it possible to build this stuff in such a way that it's still like, because you take an open source software project and install it and run it, it's going to be pretty safe, right? Like there's a collective process ongoing that makes it so that it's not a complete crapshoot. Is it possible to do the same for this? And they trail off with a question mark to that effect. Like, can we make this biohacking have the same sort of social dynamics and sort of controls as the open source software movement had? So Kyle, what's the next one about? 0x17.
All right. From the global to the local, from the cloud to our bodies, xenofeminism avows the responsibility in constructing new institutions of techno-materialist hegemonic proportions. Like engineers who must conceive of a total structure as well as the molecular parts from which it is constructed, XF emphasizes the importance of the mesopolitical sphere against the limited effectiveness of local gestures, creation of autonomous zones, and sheer horizontalism, just as it stands against transcendent or top-down impositions of values and norms. The mesopolitical area of xenofeminism's universalist ambitions comprehends itself as a mobile and intricate network of transits between these polarities. As pragmatists, we invite contamination as a mutational driver between such frontiers. So, perhaps there are many listeners who are not familiar with the notion of the mesopolitical. One place where I have encountered this is when I used to work in economics. There were people who were studying, especially people from the regulationist school in France, were studying mesoeconomic phenomena, which is to say phenomena that are in between the level of the macro and the micro. That's what the meso is about. So the mesopolitical is saying, look, localism, micropolitics are not going to get us there. However, we also recognize that to simply, buy fiat, try to change the whole world is not really a starter, right? So let's think about the in-between area. Let's try to explore that space of action instead of focusing all our energy on the micro. And as they say, like, as pragmatists, we invite contamination as a mutational driver between such frontiers, which is to say, like, the meso is a space that can sort of reconcile, like, the micro, the macro, and, like, various horizontal concerns.
This reminded me a bit of the viable system model and the sort of recursions.
This reminded me of the other book I was talking about, The Mushroom at the End of the World. Because she talks a whole lot about capitalism in that book, because it talks about kind of like how sales work by finding, matsutake mushrooms in Oregon and then selling them to Japan. And there's this whole part where she talks about non-capitalism and peri-capitalism. And like academics right now who are kind of working on an in-between capitalism, like basically, if we get rid of capitalism, what do we do next? Well, it's the next step of capitalism and I think they're calling it peri-capitalism. So that, I don't know, it's just interesting. This reminded me of this. Don't tear everything down. Move on. That's ridiculous, obviously, but move on to the next step.
Yeah, it's thinking about that in between as a productive space, right?
Yeah. So we're moving on to the overflow section, which is the kind of closing section, and 0x18. which starts out with XF asserts that adapting our behavior for an era of Promethean complexity is a labor requiring patience, but a ferocious patience at odds with waiting. So this is again sort of putting it in the sort of active, best foot forward sort of sense. And they're sort of being very active here about like asking, how are we to become hosts of this new world? How do we build better semiotic parasites? And how do we build new forms of unselfish solidarity and collective self-mastery? So it's kind of taking responsibility for engineering the mimetic contagion that they intend to proliferate, and actively reflecting on this, like what is the world we want to create, and how will I in this moment act in such a way as to bring it about? Powerful,
It sounds like cyber witchcraft to me.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'm seeing it.
Yeah, like taking control, seizing the power of the memes.
Yes.
Okay, that's a really fun angle, actually. Yeah, I quite like that paragraph, because it also pushes it onto the reader, right? Like how are you going to become a host of this new world? And it's much more than just a sort of the authors just blathering about their views. It's like very much framing it in like this. No, this isn't actually a project. This is a thing to do, not simply a thing to dream about.
Yeah, and I love how it invites the reader to join, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you're a part of this. You need to take action too. And I'm asking you, how can we do it? Like, how can you do it? So cool.
Yeah. And, this sort of pointing out of the autophagic orgy of indignity or rage, I feel like is definitely like, say like, hey, let's step back from that kind of ongoing thing that is happening online, and let's think about what we're doing here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a huge part of feminism to be angry. So anger is good, right? But I think this is specifically calling out the orgy of rage, like and like what you're talking about that you often see online, where it's like a self-feeding machine of like what is it, like articles that are infuriating, or like the most shared articles or something.
Yes.
And so like I think it's calling that out for what it is.
I've just looked up what autophagic means. Autophagy is the natural, regulated, destructive mechanism of the cell that disassembles unnecessary or dysfunctional components.
Ooh.
Ooh, boy.
Yes.
Yeah. So like self-destructive. Yeah.
It's self-destructive. Yeah.
I didn't know that. Thank you for pointing that out.
That's a fun one. I was like, what the fuck is that word?
Yeah. That makes it more powerful.
Yes.
That's like a concept of kind of like biohacking.
Yeah, totally. Like you can actually draw like a one-to-one, connection there between the diagnosis and the action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So moving on to 0x19, I'll take this one because I think there's a bit here that bears some explaining, and I think almost no one will actually get the reference they're making. So is xenofeminism a program? Not if this means anything so crude as a recipe or a single-purpose tool by which a determinate problem is solved. We prefer to think like the schemer or lisper, who seeks to construct a new language in which the problem at hand is immersed, so that the solutions for it, and for any number of related problems, might unfurl with ease. Now, this is a reference to the Lisp family of programming languages, of which Scheme is a member. And the gist of why that's important is that if you're a programmer and you're presented with some problem, like, I don't know, taking a bunch of CSV files and sending them somewhere or whatever, if you're using a language like Python, you just sort of sit down and you write Python that solves the problem. With Lisp or Scheme or these sorts of languages from this kind of family, these languages are so flexible that what you actually end up doing is you you create a sub-language in which you can express the problem, and then you use that to solve the problem. So it's a kind of a classic thing about Lispers is that they end up writing essentially their own languages and that fit the problem domain, and then solving the problem using that secondary tool. And what they're making reference to here is that same malleability, that like and the same like construction of a language with which to tackle the problem, rather than simply sitting down and typing through the problem itself. So that's what they're getting at here.
Yeah,
that is so cool.
Yeah, so like Lisp is a language for making languages. That's how it's often. Right?
That just opened up a whole new meaning for me in this paragraph.
yeah, it's what a reference to make. Like,
and it is an excellent reference. It's a fantastic reference, and it is. I really like it because it is that implication of the problem and the response, right? That the data becomes like deeply implicated in the structures that work on the data. And that is it's a very fascinating programming paradigm, and it's so interesting to see it generalized into a sort of political approach. Yeah,
that's such a great metaphor. How oppressive structures work and how feminism kind of points it out. Like feminism is the sub-language in that metaphor. Like how. Like gender studies are like 99% done by men, right? So they have like the bias of the people doing the studies,
right?
So the thing being created has the bias of who's creating it. That's so cool.
Yeah, it's fun. I really like this notion of because it gives you sort of an active agency in crafting the platform from which you're going to actually tackle the thing, and it also has this like. As they sort of say here, like incrementally bootstraps itself into existence, which is another sort of characteristic of Lisp-like languages, where the core of the language is tiny, and the rest of the language is written in Lisp. You know what I mean? Like where it's sort of defined in its own terms, and it's a thing that pulls itself up by the bootstraps, which again leans into the kind of viral. Metaphor that's been, or the sort of viral vibes that have been going on throughout this whole piece, right?
Yeah, it's a beautiful use of computational metaphors and linguistic metaphors.
Oh, it's that autopoiesis bit again.
Yeah. The last part of this paragraph made me feel better about baby steps. Because it says ours is a transformation of seeping, directed subsumption rather than rapid overthrow. Mm-hmm. It is a transformation of deliberate construction, seeking to submerge the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy in a sea of procedures that soften its shell and dismantle its defenses, so as to build a new world from the scraps. That is beautiful. That is that makes me feel good about not solved right now, and like that is a frustration that is so easy to get into as like a queer feminist, right? Like why hasn't this changed in 50 years? Why are we still having this same conversation? Why do I still have to have this argument online? I think you get like so worn out, and it goes back to the idea of like patience, that was talked about I think in the previous paragraph. Requiring patience, but a ferocious patience at odds with waiting. Like that feeling of like, why don't we have this? And the image of like the ocean drowning white supremacist capitalist patriarchy is just like, there's something so satisfying about that imagery. It like makes me feel better about being patient. Like, I don't know. That was very like cathartic for me.
Yeah. It's very good. I like it on so many levels. Like this use of this kind of almost like digestive metaphor is really interesting. And when they talk about seeping directed subsumption rather than rapid overthrow, I think that's such an interesting engagement with the language of Marxism, because in Marx's account of subsumption, the process is very much undirected, right? It's it is a sort of like long-term process of capitalism coming to subsume the rest of the world and remake it in its image, right? But, in response to that, whereas like we often think about, okay, so there is like the circuit of capital, there is this kind of like atomic unit or this genetic unit of capitalism that can proliferate and expand and reproduce capitalism. That's sort of the thing that Marx is drawing out in Capital. In response to that, we often think, like, as Marx himself did, that we need a conscious, directed, highly organized system of social change to fight back against that, to control it, to get it in hand, and to eliminate it, right? To eliminate this kind of viral thing that capitalism is. But if we think about this in terms of, like, that is the rapid overthrow, right? The Leninist seizing of state power. If we think about it instead as this like seeping directed subsumption, which is to say, like, it's not one system of social planning. It's not one party and one Politburo that is going to get this done. It is a multitude of directed processes, right? Which may be just as sort of autopoietic as capitalism itself is, right? And the way they tie that into this sort of like digestive, very like biological metaphor, as opposed to going to like the language of physics, which is very much where, the oppositional forces and like lots of sort of like war language that is typically used in Marxism comes from. I think it's a very nice conceptual, metaphorical move they make here that really helps to just reframe the problem.
Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of Octavia Butler and Ursula K. Le Guin in this paragraph. Like the seed theory, Ursula K. Le Guin's seed pouch or seed bag or whatever. We have to plant the seeds to make the change, not use a sword and kill it. And that we have to, and that's like innately feminine, and that we, in Octavia Butler, just sounds like the parable of the sower, where she's like, I know how to change this post-apocalyptic hellscape we're in. I just have to invent a new religion that everyone has to follow, and that religion will change. It's using those tools to change, the same tools, just subverting them. It's just super cool. Like lots of sci-fi, feminist ideas here that are kind of summed up, like you said, kind of like through like with the Marxism as well. Super, super interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's sort of this definitely fits in that kind of post-accelerationist milieu as well, where the accelerationists look at capital and its sort of rhizomatic nature, and they conclude that it can't be beaten. But this is a call to create something that outperforms capital at its own game.
Yeah,
that is even more viral and corrosive than capital is.
Yeah, it's real good.
Fantastic. I like it. So Kira, do you want to lead us out on the last section?
Sure. Xenofeminism indexes the desire to construct an alien feature with a triumphant X on a mobile map. This X does not mark a destination. It is the insertion of a topological keyframe for the formation of new logic. Just kind of talking about everything we just talked about right there. In affirming a feature untethered to the repetition of the present, we militate for ampliative capacities, for spaces of freedom with a richer geometry than the aisle, the assembly line, and the feed. I love that sentence. We need new affordances of perception and action unblinkered by naturalized identity. In the name of feminism, nature shall no longer be a refuge of injustice or a basis for any political justification whatsoever. If nature is unjust, change nature.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Good stuff.
So good. I love that they break it down into Like they're even taking it into kind of like the ecofeminism of like, cows being forcefully impregnated, and just the whole system of what this might look like.
Yeah, and you can also read that as like the Twitter feed, right?
Yeah, totally. The social media, all kinds of.
Yeah, it definitely works both ways.
Oh yeah, that's what's so good about that word.
Yeah. So I thoroughly enjoyed reading this. I think there's a couple of, amongst all the it's a pretty short work and it's pretty dense, but I think there's a couple of duds. Maybe there's one or two that are a bit not especially not they're not up to the standard of the rest of them. I think that's why they stand out. But overall, this is compelling stuff. Very compelling.
Yeah. I completely agree. I think that this text definitely benefits from the sort of treatment we've given it of going through point by point and discussing it and drawing things out, because there are some parts of it that can be a little bit like elliptical, a little bit less punchy than you might want in a manifesto. But when you sit down and talk each one over, which was kind of the point of the Communist Manifesto in the first place, right, was to get workers to pick it up and read it out in their workplaces and then talk about it. It definitely benefits from that. And I would also say that, like, if you want to check out the follow up book, Xenofeminism, it's also really good at being very like. It presents a lot of similar ideas in a less sort of like punchy manifesto form. So like it's very clear and it takes the space necessary to develop the ideas. So it's a really great complement to this document.
I've only gotten through one chapter of the book so far. I think it's really good. It's very well written, and I think its style is a lot easier to grapple with because I found this discussion here of this this manifesto to be really helpful because like some of the language in this is very twisty turny, and it probably makes more sense if you're immersed in this sort of milieu. But like for me, it was a couple of these paragraphs completely just bounced off me. I couldn't really extract much of anything from them, but then talking them over here has helped a lot. I didn't have that trouble at all with the book so far. It's a lot more plain spoken. But hey, it's a manifesto. They're putting on a show, right? Like it's a big song and a dance, you know.
Well, I mean, also much how Donna Haraway writes, so it's just very dense and layered and difficult, I think.
Yeah, okay, I'm glad it's not just me then.
Yeah, it's very academic. It's very heavy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think given the academic background that some of this collective is coming from, they did a pretty good job of writing a text that is understandable and has punch, which is what you want in a manifesto. Like, you don't want a doctoral thesis, right? You want it to just hit, right? And yeah, that's really tough coming from an academic background where you're trained to do the opposite. So I am impressed with what they've done here.
Yeah, this is really interesting in relation to, just like I said, the other academic stuff I've been reading that's more recent, right? Like how a lot of feminists moved into talking about the Anthropocene, and now they're moving into talking about xenofeminism. Like the Xenofeminism book just came out earlier this year.
Yes. So
this is like edge of your seat feminism.
Yeah.
Which is hard. I mean, it's hard to find. Like a lot of feminism is from the 80s and 90s. So a lot of it's great to just even have stuff like this being made and discussing our contemporary issues in a collected volume like that, like the stuff with social media and globalization and automation and all that, which is like huge feminist issues. So it's really interesting to kind of see like the xenofeminism thing. When I first thought it might be talking about what Donna Haraway was talking about at the end of Staying with the Trouble, which is kind of like, she's like, we need to create sci-fi futures and tell stories about what the future might look like and how we might we might build within the ruins of this culture, basically. And how important it is to create those stories, like stories of building communities, stories of building tools, instead of like the post-apocalyptic pornography that we're obsessed with right now, like the end of the world. And these feminists are positing like, hey, the end of the world is already here, and we need to start rebuilding. Here's how we could do it. And I think xenofeminism is pointing towards that as well.
Yeah, it's great. And I mean, this is a recurring theme for the show, right? That like, it's nice to have stuff that's up to date, and actually tackles stuff that is relevant right now. It's great. Is there anything else you'd like to mention before we wrap this one up?
I think I would just say on that point that, this final line, if nature is unjust, change nature. Well, in relation to the sort of climate catastrophe and the utter collapse of biodiversity in the world that we are facing today, we have changed nature. We just did it in a terrible direction. And that really gets back to the point at the start of the manifesto, which is saying that, like, technology is not politically ambivalent, and none of these processes are politically ambivalent, and therefore it's incumbent on us to change nature and change it towards the sorts of normative goals we want to see in the world. And so I think it's very, very well stated there.
Yeah, I like it. If we're going to change nature, which we do and are, then it better be a directed process.
Yes.
Not this headless, dead-eyed drive that we have at the moment.
Yeah, which is the big fuck you to accelerationism, right? Yeah. I'm here for it. Get out of here, Nick Land.
I love how ruthlessly mean we were to Nick Land in the episode. Just gut punching him over and over again. And I'll never apologize for that.
No.
If he wants to fight, I will rent a boxing ring. I will stump up the money for it, and we can actually fight. Yeah, exactly.
Oh boy.
Oh boy. Thanks, listeners, for coming along on this journey with us. Thanks, Kira, for graciously coming in with us too. And it was fantastic. I'm glad to have a perspective on this that isn't just us, just two jocks just sort of rabbiting about this stuff. We would never have attempted to read this on the show if we couldn't get someone who wasn't us to talk about it also.
That's very xenofeminist of you.
Very.
Thank you. You brought so much to this discussion on so many levels, and I'm so happy to have participated in it with you.
God, can you imagine how bad this episode would have been if it was just us? Just cluelessly stumbling through the material. Absolute buffoons.
Oh gosh. I think you both did pretty well. I loved all your Marxism and philosophy and stuff like that too.
Yeah, thanks. But that's it for Xenofeminism. If you've enjoyed the show, maybe think about heading over to Twitter @GIUnitPod. Maybe follow us there. We're on Facebook as General Intellect Unit, and if you really enjoyed the show, maybe head over to patreon.com/General Intellect Unit to throw us a couple of bucks a month and help keep the show running. And I guess get the last word. Kira, is there anything you'd like to plug, or online stuff, etc.?
Oh yeah, I have a ton of online stuff. Full-time, I write tabletop role-playing games and LARPs and weird experimental stuff. I just finished my game Something Is Wrong Here, which is a strange identity confusion, uncanny game based on the work of David Lynch, which if you like David Lynch, you will like this game. Soon to be available to the public. Fantastically kickstarted. And I also have a game, A Cozy Den, in which you play lesbian snakes who are trying to make their winter den together. And you can find those on my website. My game design company is called Serpent Cyborg Games, and you can find me on Patreon as well at Kira Magrann, and on Twitter at Kira Nunzi.
yeah, we'll throw links to the stuff into the show notes as well. So you have to just click through. Fantastic. Yeah. Thanks again, listeners, for coming with us. Thanks, Kira, and we'll see you all again in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.